I want to thank everyone for joining us for this very important hearing on the role of women in science and ways we can continue to support advanced practice among women in science. We've had a number of hearings in this subcommittee on this. My dear friend and ranking member, Dr. Ehlers, is very interested in it. And of course, Eddie Bernice Johnson, the author of the legislation before us today, is quite interested in this as well. Under normal circumstances, I would have a long statement written for me by staff, but we have votes on the floor possibly fairly early this morning, and in the interest of hearing witnesses, I will enter my own opening remarks into the record, and would recognize now Dr. Ehlers for comments if he wishes to make some.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would agree with that. I don't have a long opening statement. I have a short one. Nevertheless, I ask consent to enter it into the record, and also just want to thank Dr. Ginther for being here. I've had the pleasure of talking to her on the telephone, persuaded her to come, and I very much look forward to her testimony. I'm sure she has much to offer to this hearing.
I thank all the witnesses, Dr. Ginther. You know it's hard to turn down our good friend, Dr. Ehlers. And I thank all our witnesses. And with that, I will introduce the witnesses so that we can begin the testimony. Dr. Lynda T. Carlson is Director of the Division of Science Resource Statistics in the Directorate for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences at the National Science Foundation. Dr. Lynda G. Blevins is Senior Technical Advisor in the Office of the Deputy Director for Science Programs at the Department of Energy. And Dr. Donna K. Ginther, as introduced by Dr. Ehlers, is an Associate Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Economics and Business Analysis in the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Kansas. As our witnesses should know, this is we ask folks to limit their testimony to 5 minutes, and then we follow up by questions. This is generally a friendly, bipartisan committee. It's not like the spooky ones you see on TV. So we look forward to your comments. We'll have a good discussion, and I thank you for being here. Dr. Carlson.
Chairman Baird, Ranking Members Ehlers. Hear me now? Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ehlers, and members of the Subcommittee. I'm Lynda Carlson, Director of NSF's Division of Science Resource Statistics, or SRS. How about that? Great. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. SRS is one of the 14 major statistical agencies, and our major responsibility is for data collection and analysis related to the entire science enterprise. We produce the biennial science and engineering indicators, as well as the women, minorities, and persons with disabilities science and engineering reports. NSF cannot support the proposed legislation as the data collection and analysis requirements will be excessive. Let me illustrate with these examples. First, NSF itself, as part of the grants process, currently collects annual composite information on demographics, field, award type, budget request, review score, and funding outcomes for all of its proposals and awards. However, principal investigators, or PIs, are not, nor can they be, required to provide demographic information as a condition of obtaining an award because of the Privacy Act. Hence, the demographic information collected is incomplete. For example, the number of PIs who submitted proposals and did not declare a race or ethnicity in 2007 was nearly as large as those who provided a response. And over the last 10 years, the proportion of new principal investigators reporting their gender has declined. Second, I'll refer to some lessons we learned in conducting 2 surveys that characterize R&D conducted in the federal sector: the Survey of Federal Funds for Research and Development, and the Survey of Federal Science and Engineering Support to Universities, Colleges, and Nonprofit Institutions. For these surveys, SRS must obtain data from science funding agencies on the type of activity supported and on the funding recipient. It has been increasingly difficult for SRS to obtain high-quality data in a timely manner from the queried agencies. Agencies do not usually keep detailed information about the science fields that they support. And even when an agency does maintain data by field, it may not conform to SRS's data categorization system. In short, different agencies maintain their records in quite different ways to meet their particular needs. And SRS does not have the authority to require funding agencies to maintain or transfer needed data. As a result of such issues, SRS commissioned the National Research Council's Committee on National Statistics to form a panel and hold a series of workshops to assist us in revising these surveys. The panel was recently formed, and the first workshop will be held in June of 2008. The resulting recommendations are expected to be released in early 2009. A third and final example speaks to efforts to collect data on gender. The NSF Authorization Act of 2002 required NSF to examine differences in amounts requested and award by gender in major federal external grants. SRS contracted with the RAND Corporation to conduct the survey. The results were released in 2005. For this study, we had intended to collect data on grants by gender from NSF, USDA, all of HHS, and the Departments of Defense and Energy. Data collection was only feasible from NSF, NIH, and USDA. Adequate data on grants, applications, and awards were not available for the Departments of Defense or Energy or the remainder of HHS. From this effort, we learned that better tracking of gender differences would require that all agencies maintain a data system that stores information on all grants and investigators, and that all agencies include key personnel characteristics for each investigator in the application form, among other requirements. Mr. Chairman, I hope that these examples illustrate the complexities of the data collection requirements called for in this legislation. The Chief Financial Officer's Grants Policy Committee, which is charged with oversight of government-wide grants policy initiatives, might be able to provide additional insight into such a data collection. Thank you.
Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ehlers, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'd like to provide you with some information about 2 gender equity workshops. In January of 2006, the academic chemistry community pioneered a format for a gender equity workshop. The workshop got its start because the chemistry community observed that 50% of their bachelor's degrees went to women and 35% of their PhDs went to women, but only 13% of the faculty members in the top 50 university chemistry departments were women. Top 50 refers to departments that receive the most federal research dollars. The workshop thus targeted the participation of the chairs from these departments. Around the time of the chemistry workshop, 2 National Academies reports were released, Rising Above the Gathering Storm and Beyond Bias and Barriers. And these 2 reports reinforced the DOE Office of Science's motivation to be involved in gender equity workshops. In May of 2007, the physics community hosted a workshop of its own, based on the chemistry model, but having some different features. Each of these workshops, while organized by the relevant research community, has involved the major funding agencies for the given scientific field. For example, the chemistry workshop was co-funded and advised by DOE, NSF, and NIH. The physics workshop involved DOE and NSF. I'd like to highlight a few important points about the workshops. First, the workshops are community-driven. The steering committees are made of distinguished research scientists within the discipline, and the workshops are designed to create a sense of ownership of the outcomes within each scientific community. Involvement of high-level federal officials from the relevant funding programs seems significant in reinforcing the importance of the topical matter. The workshop concept uses demographic data and social science to examine the underlying causes of gender gaps in science. Data-driven science is emphasized over anecdotes, and social science is presented objectively. Planning such a workshop involves an enormous amount of work. Each community has a unique demographic and a unique culture, which means each workshop may have different features. For example, because women are underrepresented at all levels in physics, that workshop had a session on education issues that did not appear in the chemistry workshop. Each workshop brings an experienced and influential group together to tackle tough issues. Attendance is limited to about 100 people, and participants include department chairs, speakers that include social scientists, federal officials, and opinion leaders. For physics, managers from 13 DOE national laboratories were invited along with the top 50 chairs. Workshops include lectures, panel discussions, and breakout sessions. Interactive theater and implicit bias demonstrations can shift perspectives and encourage community action. Action items are developed in the breakout sessions, and participants are asked to select and commit to carrying them out. Tools such as interactive websites allow the organizers from the communities to track progress over time. The metrics for success proposed and used so far by the communities have been attitude changes as measured using approved pre- and post-workshop surveys and tracking of the documented commitment by the participants to implement action items and their regular follow-up progress reports. For the chemistry workshop, these metrics are already demonstrating early success. The workshops have not revealed differences between federally funded research and development centers and universities in their potential for implicit bias. There are some other differences, though. First, FFRDCs do not always have discrete disciplinary units like academic departments. Second, while universities have tenure, FFRDCs have various promotion systems, and these differences create challenges for designing common workshops. So development of this workshop series is being driven by the scientific communities and has demonstrated some initial success. The model for these workshops continues to evolve. The agencies funding and advising these workshops have forged good working relationships with each other and with the communities working to achieve gender equity. And the innovative nature of each workshop and of the workshop concept has drawn and continues to maintain DOE's interest in participating. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak before you today, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Folks are amazing. We had 4 seconds left on your time clock. This is unprecedented. We'll see if Dr. Ginther can hit the mark as well. Dr. Ginther, thank you very much.
Chairman Barrett, Ranking Member Ehlers, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the pending legislation. I'm an economist specializing in research on academic labor markets. My NSF-funded research examines the question, does science discriminate against women? My research shows that women who have children are less likely to enter academic science careers. Thus, the single most important step that Congress can take to help women is to allow universities to count child care facilities towards indirect costs in order to expand the availability of child care for academic caregivers. I've been asked to comment on data availability related to gender disparities in specific proposals of the Act. I comment on these now. In terms of data, I use the NSF's Survey of Doctorate Recipients in my research. This is an excellent data source. However, with all data, there are some limitations. I find that there are no gender gaps in the promotion of scientists to tenure or full professor. I find, however, gender gaps in the promotion of social scientists, especially in my own discipline of economics, and I find gender gaps in salary at the full professor level. However, I cannot attribute all of these gender gaps to bias because there are key factors missing in the data that might explain the gender gap. The first is productivity. There is no availability of annual publications, citations, and annual patents. Second will be dual career concerns. We don't have information on spouses' education, employment, and earnings. Finally, it would be useful to have information on caregiving, time women spend in childcare and house-time work. Now I turn to specific aspects of the proposal. In terms of the workshops on gender bias, the goal is that information about implicit bias will lead to changes in behavior. First, when implementing these workshops, a valid research design is essential. Treatment and control groups should evaluate the same proposal, and then any difference in evaluation can be judged as a result of these workshops on bias. We need to evaluate the workshops based on outcomes. Second, it is important to provide training for the principal investigators who supervise postdocs, because this is where the system seems to break down for women. Third, I recommend that we expand these workshops to include mentoring activities for both postdocs and junior faculty. Mentoring for junior faculty complements mentoring for evaluators and treats both sides of the problem. Second, the Act calls for extending grant support for caregiving. Both the NSF and NIH provide for no-cost extensions of grant monies, and these practices should be implemented across federal funding agencies. Finally, I've been asked to comment on the federal role in gender equity. First and foremost, the federal government should provide grant support to caregivers through direct and indirect costs. We should count daycare facilities towards indirect costs, therefore subsidizing access to daycare on campus, and federal guidelines should be modified to allow charging grants for childcare during conferences and for travel for small children to conferences. Second, we need to provide financial support for improved data collection and research analysis in order to understand the gender disparities and point to solutions to these problems. Third, we need to evaluate gender intervention programs based on outcomes and disseminate best practices. Advance can provide a model for other federal agencies. Mr. Chairman, once again, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The underrepresentation of women in academic science results from more than implicit or explicit bias. Although bias may play a role, my research suggests that the difficulties women face in balancing work and family in the postdoctoral years cause too many women to leave science. Immediate childcare support on campus for graduate students, postdoctoral students, and faculty, better data and greater access to that data, and rigorous evaluations of interventions will allow for a more complete picture of the problem and point to necessary solutions. I will be happy to answer any questions about my testimony.
Thank the witnesses for very informative and concise and relevant testimony. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes and follow that. Dr. Ehlers, we've been joined, by the way, by Dr. Bartlett. Thank you, Dr. Bartlett. Dr. Carlson, one of the questions I have, as you describe the situation, it sounds like you're gathering a fair bit of data, but it is incomplete and variable across the agencies that are submitting the data. You also described that you've got a you're in some consultative process to try to perhaps improve that set. If that consultative process is successful, could you gather the sort of data that is requested in this legislation, and would it be of use to you to do so?
Data on gender and ethnicity and race is an individual cannot be forced to provide that as part of the Privacy Act. I'm sorry. So that data, there's no way that one can compel that. It's actually an issue of working with the individual agencies to have them request the data needed, and there's no way that we can actually push the agencies to do that. I think really the best way is to work through the Chief Financial Officer's Council, and that might be a way to handle it.
So that, Dr. Blevins, these workshops you describe, I was very pleased to hear that you focus on data, research-based information about what are the obstacles for women continuing in the science career path. We had a prior hearing where, among others, Dr. Shalala spoke, and one of the things that came up was the point you have all made, essentially, that really just number of baccalaureate level folks is pretty good for women. There's this precipitous drop down the road a ways. What specifically about your workshops addresses that would be one point. And the second would be, if, as this legislation recommends, would require there be these training workshops, how would we make sure that the caliber of the workshop is good? I have had the opportunity in my own academic career to participate in both gender and ethnic sensitivity type workshops, and the caliber, quite frankly, has varied a great deal. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so the first question: what's specific about the workshop addresses this fall off in the statistics?
The data, specifically the research data that tells us what causes the fall off. Dr. Ginther pointed a few points out.
Right. I think the workshops focus on all sorts of things. One is this idea of implicit bias and gender schemas, and the other is just sort of policies and practices of the universities and the institutions that might not make them very good places to work. For example, a graduate student might not find a faculty career very attractive. That's come up several times because of the types of policies and practices. For example, one example of that is, which is a simple one, which was surprising to me, is when do you hold your faculty meetings? Some folks hold them on Saturdays or, at 5 o'clock in the evening. And so that's kind of a simple one that can sort of make the environment better for men and women, actually. Almost all of these things are really geared toward that.
As a father of 2 twins, I appreciate that. 3-year-old boys.
And so it's really a rich format with a very experienced group of department chairs, federal officials, and scientists of all types that come together and bring a lot of expertise into these breakout sessions. And for example, at the physics workshop, they talked. One of the universities talked about how it was implementing a part-time tenure track. So there are a lot of interesting and different ideas that come out of them. How do we keep the caliber of the workshops high? Or how do the communities keep the caliber? I think the key concept here is to make them data-driven and to really focus on data so that people don't walk out of the room kind of thinking, oh, that's somebody else's problem and not mine. I think if you really focus on the data, from the social science and whatnot, these people who attend really take ownership, I think, of this issue. And so we talk a lot about how to make them different from what's been held in the past, and I think it's more than just everyone getting around telling their stories about how bad it is for them. We try to avoid that, and we try to really keep it data-focused.
Sounds like you achieved that, and I'm sure Dr. Ginther, her data set would be, Dr. Your data set seems quite relevant to that. One quick question, and then I'll recognize Dr. Ehlers. Has anyone estimated the costs? I support the idea of considering providing indirect costs for the child care. Have we got an estimate of the cost of that?
I checked with the NIH, and they say it's permissible to use child care facilities towards indirect costs, though no grantees do so. So I don't know how it would, I don't know the specifics of how it would be implemented. It's possible, and I don't know why other institutions aren't doing it.
Thank you. Dr. Ehlers, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Ginther, you recommend the establishment of a valid research design to measure the effectiveness of the workshops proposed by this legislation. Can you suggest how that might be incorporated into the legislation? And would you recommend that these workshops start out on a pilot basis with a good evaluation mechanism?
I think that whenever you're evaluating an intervention, you need to have a treatment and control group. So if you're targeting, say, grant reviewers, you would have a treatment group that goes through the gender bias workshop, and then you'd have a control group that doesn't, and then they'd look at the same proposal, and then you look at the evaluations coming out of the treatment and control group, compare the two, and see whether or not bias played a role in the evaluations, whether or not there were average differences. Women were evaluated better by the people who had the gender bias training. That would prove scientifically that these workshops have a significant effect. We're doing a similar approach with our mentoring workshops in the American Economic Association. We've held 3 so far, and we have about 80 participants who are randomly assigned to a treatment and control group, and then we look at these young scholars as their careers evolve, and we see whether or not the mentoring workshops actually have a significant effect. And then once we've shown that or failed to show that, then we can sort of say these policies are important and should be disseminated widely across the disciplines. But I agree with Dr. Blevins' point that each discipline has a specific set of issues, and these need to be discipline-specific in order to be effective.
Another question. If work-family trade-offs are at least a significant factor, maybe an extremely significant factor, but the question is, does your research indicate that these trade-off decisions are more acute in science and engineering than in other disciplines?
I have not evaluated the humanities, but I have evaluated science and social science, and I find that women tend to leave between the doctorate and getting on the tenure track in both disciplines. What I've also found is that each discipline is different. So in engineering, for example, you see women entering tenure track jobs at higher rates than men, but they're more likely to drop out of the tenure track if they have a child. So these work-family trade-offs really seem to affect every woman in academia. But I think they are more likely to affect women in that period of purgatory known as the postdoc. You know, you're just you don't have faculty status, you don't have student status, and it's not clear whether or not there's a job going to come out at the other end, and therefore I can assume, judging by what's happening in the data, I can't prove this definitively, by judging by what happens, they decide to opt out.
But of those, when this happens on the postdoc level,
Yeah.
it's more or less permanent, right?
Yeah, I mean that's an irrevocable decision.
But if they're on tenure track, and they may drop out for a few years.
Well, now in the tenure track, I find no significant differences in the sciences of women making it through. So women and men are promoted to tenure and to full professor at equal rates once they get to the tenure track in science.
Mm-hmm.
Not true in social science.
Oh, I see. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So in other words, we scientists are more fair-minded.
Well, I think I would state it a little differently. You scientists pre-screen your tenure track applicants. There's a screening mechanism called the postdoc.
Okay.
And social scientists don't have postdocs on average, and so then you see the screening happening on the tenure track.
Okay. Sorry. I thought I had
Yeah.
discovered something important. Dr. Blevins.
You're engaging in confirmation bias. Is that
But I hide my biases very well. I do have lots of them. Dr. Blevins, do you have any indication that the attitude perception shifts resulting from the workshops resulted in or led to institutional change? Did you follow this up?
In fact, follow-up is being done for the chemistry workshop by the Committee on the Advancement of Women Chemists. And that they have an interactive website and they have collected input. And in fact, there have been some anecdotal pieces entered into the website about some of the changes. And I've written about some of those in my testimony. Let me see if I can. I remember that there were things about changing the way they interviewed candidates and creating more concrete criteria by which everyone would evaluate the candidates in writing, working on this child care issue, changing their faculty meeting times and things like that. So, in fact, I think it's nearly half of the chairs that attended have gone in and entered updates into the website 2 years later, which is I think a very high success rate.
All right. I think my time has expired, and I'm afraid we have to go vote.
Yes, we are down to 5 minutes voting, and without boring you with the details of what lies ahead for us, and what lies ahead for you is about a 45-minute wait, and we regret that, but we will likely, I don't foresee us likely coming back before 11:15. So let's just give everybody that as a predictable time. It is possible we run over a few minutes, but Dr. Bartlett, if you a couple minutes, the challenges, I don't know how tight they're.
Thank you very much. As I have a markup in a subcommittee, so I cannot come back after the votes. We only have a couple of minutes before we need to run for votes. Anything that we can do to encourage more of our young people, particularly women who have largely been underrepresented in these areas, to go into science, math, and engineering is enormously important. I just read a statistic yesterday that really alarmed me. 60% of all of the patents that come to our patent office come from inventors outside the United States. This year, China will graduate 6 times as many engineers as we graduate, and more than 50% of all of the students in our sciences for post-college education are foreign students. So we face enormous challenges. And we just pretty much ignored full 50% of our potential by not encouraging women to go into these disciplines. I'm very much concerned about any discrimination, but I'm even more concerned about a culture which does not appreciate people in these areas. And I just think that we need to change the culture so that these careers are valued. A culture gets what it appreciates, and we just don't appreciate these careers. We appreciate singers and dancers and football players and so forth. Just look who gets invited to the White House, where they slobber all over them rather than academic figures. They're sports and entertainers and so forth. Don't you think we really need a culture change in this country? And you are very effective representatives, 3 very attractive women, bright. You just need to be out and about more so that people can see, gee, there really is an opportunity for women in these disciplines, isn't there? Thank you very much for your testimony. I'm sorry we don't have more time for conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bartlett. Thank you. Please indulge with your patience. I apologize for the interruption. It's beyond our control. We'll rush off and vote and come back as quickly as we can. But I think it's very improbable we'd be back before 11:15. So let's make it 11:10, if you would. Let's try to come back at 11:10 just in case we get lucky early, and then we'll reconvene. Thank you very much.
That's the nice thing about being at a Oh, really? Oh, well, that makes, yeah. Oh, okay.
I think it's hard to believe that this world is in the hands of people like us. Off the record.
The meeting will now come to order again. We apologize profoundly to our witnesses. This has not been our finest hour over on the floor. A series of procedural votes make it very unpredictable. Dr. Ehlers and I have agreed mutually that we respect for the witnesses who've traveled so far and made such effort to give us good testimony. We're going to miss a couple of votes in order that we can be here and hear from you. So with that, Dr. Ehlers, I will recognize you because I know you have some further questions, and then I'll resume. Don't have any other witness possible. Eddie Bernice Johnson from Texas will join us as well. But Dr. Ehlers, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I want to follow up with several questions for Dr. Ginther, since she traveled a great distance to be here. NSF is working to establish a productivity database. Once this information is available, can you speak to how it will expand the existing knowledge base and understanding of the advancement of female faculty members?
If I may sort of make one small correction, I propose to create the productivity database with the survey of doctorate recipients as part of a grant that I submitted in 2004. And the goal of creating this data was to merge publications, citations, and patents onto the survey of doctorate recipients. And this is a work in progress, but the goal is to see what other factors may explain why women have not advanced or don't participate in science at the same numbers as men. And so does productivity, for example, explain why women in economics are less likely to get tenure? How do these other variables, as economists, we're we assume that people are paid and promoted based on how productive they are. And in academia, you can measure productivity much better than you can, say, in the private sector. So my goal with the creation of this data is to see if there are gender differences in productivity and how they affect the careers of men and women in science. And there are also positive externalities to creating these data because you can examine a number of other questions, like why has science in the United States slowed down in terms of number of publications relative to the rest of the world. So the goal is to create the data, and there's a great interest in the research community for using it. And hopefully it will sort of help us narrow down why women are not as prevalent in science and social science.
In a nutshell, it seems to me what I've heard said this morning is that women are not as productive or don't seem to advance as much, primarily because of the child care issue.
That's what my research indicates, yes.
Yeah. Okay. And just a quick question, Dr. Carlson, Dr. Blevins, do you find that also in your experience and in the research you've reviewed?
We haven't really looked at that, so I...
Okay. But that indicates to me it's not a matter of sexual bias so much as the practical aspect of how is the child care within the family handled. Okay, I'm drawing a conclusion. I won't ask you to support or disagree with it. But Dr. Ginther, one other question I had, including all principal investigators in the workshop, seems like it would be difficult. Can you recommend another method to reach the PIs who directly oversee postdocs regarding improving the postdoctoral experience for women?
I would say that, before you reach all PIs, just do a test, see if providing them information about bias and other barriers that women face in science and in the postdoc period matters. Have a treatment and control group. And then if it does, then you can sort of selectively identify PIs, especially those who have a number of postdocs that they supervise, and try to disseminate it that way. So, I agree it would be really prohibitively expensive to train each PI, but it would be really useful to know whether or not training the PIs would matter. And then if it does, you can disseminate this information to the professional societies and help them to get the message out.
It's not clear to me. I really appreciate what you're saying. It seems to me you've got a good handle on things. But how would excuse me, how would you proceed to design pilot programs to institute this?
Okay, so you take an agency like NIH, which funds a significant number of postdocs, and you say a condition of funding is that you take a random sample of 100, you take 50 and you train them, and you take 50 and you don't, and then you sort of do a survey and follow up on progress that their postdoc makes. And NIH gives millions of dollars for postdoc training. They have traineeships and fellowships. And then you can evaluate how these women and men differentially progress out of the postdoc and into careers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Being a physical scientist, I hadn't thought of NIH as being the first test bed, but you're obviously right. They have more money, more postdocs.
Yeah, they have, 70% of all life scientists have to have a postdoc before advancing to an academic career.
Yeah.
And now I think the mean is more than one.
Okay, my time has expired. I yield back.
Dr. Blevins, did you want to comment further on the question line that Dr. Ehlers was pursuing there?
Well, I want to qualify that I'm also a physical scientist, not a social scientist, and but I think some of the social scientists who have spoken at our workshops might differ some with what you said. So I would just urge you to talk to some of the folks who have come to the workshops and spoken.
What would they tell us?
Well, I think the issue of implicit bias is something that men and women experience and hold and are not always aware that they do. And I mean, these are the things that I learned at the workshop from the social scientists. While any one thing might seem like a small thing to which somebody might be overreacting, if you add up the sum total of all those things over a course of a person's career, they can, there's a concept of accumulation of disadvantage that comes into play. So I have to say I'm a little uncomfortable and outside of my comfort zone on this because I'm not a social scientist, but I would just say that that the prevailing sentiment at the workshops has been that it's more than just a child care issue.
Hence, we might make some dent into, I'm not even sure retention is the right word, but advancement may even be a better word. Differentials, if we provided child care, but that might not be sufficient, maybe necessary but not sufficient. Would that be a fair statement?
I think the issue is complex. You know, I'm not saying that there's no such thing as bias in science. But for bias to explain everything, it would have to show up in a lot more places than it does. You know, women in science, once they get on the tenure track, are equally likely to get tenure and to become full professor. But at the full professor level, for some reason, there's a 13% pay gap that I can't explain by observable characteristics. Now, I don't have every observable characteristic. I don't have their productivity. And, you know, as an economist, we believe people are paid according to their productivity. And it's only until I can disprove that I will even be able to publish this research in the economics profession.
Well, you can disprove that by visiting Congress. Hang around here for a while, you'll see that productivity is not necessarily directly correlated to pay.
Right. Hey, but your pay's set, right?
Yeah. QED. The question remains. So we've had people tell us in this committee that child care is a factor, but there are also cultural factors, that there are implicit bias, etc. What happens to the women who leave? I mean, there's an implicit assumption here that it's a bad thing to leave academia. Dr. Ehlers and I might not always agree with that. We've left. What happens to the women who don't go on in either the academic field or the professional field? It'd be one thing if we said, well, X% of X% higher numbers of women drop out from that profession, and we assume that's a bad thing. But if they go on to things that they personally deem to be more rewarding, either financially or monetarily, it may be a bad thing in terms of lost productivity. But is it a bad thing for the women themselves? I'm playing devil's advocate here. I recognize that. Any thoughts on that?
This is sort of my area of expertise. What happens is if you leave science or if you leave any professional career, your human capital quickly depreciates. And if you want to re-enter the labor force, you're not going to be able to do so. And I think that's especially true, and receive the same pay as when you left. And I think that's especially true in science because science moves so quickly. If women leave science, they're not going to be able to come back and be scientists once they leave. And so, you know, there's a loss in human capital.
But my assumption, the assumption there is that they go somewhere that is somewhat of a dead end instead of going somewhere, you know, for example, as competitive as the field is in the professions, maybe people, I'm speculating, it may not be true, maybe they're leaving an academic career to go to a private enterprise career and make more money and have more success. I don't assume.
I think that's true in certain disciplines, right? You know, engineering, you know, the track out of a PhD in engineering is into the private sector because the jobs there pay better
Yeah.
than academia. But some jobs, I mean, you can't really do particle physics in the private sector.
Uh-huh.
And so as a result, I mean, you have an option of the labs, the university, or not doing particle physics. So, I can't really comment on what they end up doing, but we see in all levels of highly educated women are leaving the labor force now, outside of academia, and it seems to correlate with having children.
Yeah. So we've got to address that. There's no question.
Right.
But Dr. Blevins seems to be asserting that there's much more to it than that there are these biases, et cetera, et cetera. So hence, that's the workshop component that is, back to this legislation per se, that's the workshop component, and that's the rationale. What is not in this legislation, and Dr. Ehlers, I'm running over here, but what is not in this legislation that you believe should be, if we're to try to redress some, obviously the issue Dr. Ginther has raised already about indirect costs for child care. What else is there?
Well, there's how to spend direct costs towards covering, from your grants, towards covering issues like child care for travel. I think Mr. Campbell testified previously that the OMB rules are too restrictive about that.
Okay. Other thoughts? Dr. Ehlers, I recognize you for...
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Neither do I, and with that, I thank the witnesses for their patience, and we apologize for the interruptions and the distractions. It's a difficult environment. They have not yet asked Dr. Ehlers how we would run the schedule here, but I can assure you it'd be much different. And so thank you for your time, and thanks for the guests who joined us today as well in the audience. And with that, this hearing stands adjourned. And if people have follow-up comments they wish to offer, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you know.